because I've always wanted to ask this of an Australian. Uh, why is that the case? Why do Australians live more on the coastline than they do in more inland?
So inland is that very dry. Sorry, a good portion of inland is that very dry, arid Arizona desert
Ah,
style,
okay.
type of plain. The famous icon in the middle of Australia, basically called Ayers Rock, or the official name is Uluru. It's a massive rock, basically, but it's a big red rock just sitting there in the middle of nowhere, essentially.
Okay.
But that's essentially why it's not particularly friendly place to live because of the just because of the climate and the environment. But we have a number of communities that live in that area, primarily in those sort of desert spaces. So there's some of our indigenous, fundamentally indigenous communities
Right.
that live out in our bush, in that
Mhm.
space. But no, most of the cities, water, you need humans always need water, and so
Right. True.
inland, it's not that reliable to have water. So essentially, when when the English, colonized, if you like, or when the English
Mhm.
arrived here 230 years ago, whatever it was, 240 years ago, we stuck to the coast.
Okay. All right. So if I were to travel to Australia, like if I were to visit Brisbane or Sydney or Melbourne, uh, what are the differences between like those cities I mentioned or a city like Perth? What are the differences in the different cities and areas in Australia?
Well, firstly, Cole, congratulations. You pronounced those cities accurately.
Oh, thank you.
Oh yeah, you said Melbourne, not
Melbourne.
Melbourne.
Right. Hmm.
Americans would be very common to say Melbourne, but no,
Right.
those are probably the four largest cities that you mentioned there. So Perth
Hmm.
is renowned. It's on the very far west, and when I say far, I mean far
Hmm.
western part of the country. So it's basically, it shares an ocean with Africa. Okay. And so it is actually known as, I think, the most remote city in the world. So even here, the city I'm from, Adelaide, or the closest city, Queen Adelaide, we're named after. But Adelaide, I think it takes us three or 4 hours, I think, to fly to Perth, and it's
Okay.
in the same country. It's just one state away, okay. But to
Right.
fly there, we're the closest next capital city to get there. So Perth is remote. It's really known for that, and there's a lot of mining in that part of Australia, and a lot of South Africans immigrate there. They come from Africa. That's about as far as they can go, and they sort of stay there. But the other cities you mentioned, Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne, are essentially the east. So they're the very opposite end. One thing that's really fun to
Right.
do, I'd encourage the audience to do, is to Google image the map of Australia overlaid on America or Europe if you're European, because
Mm.
you'll just see how big our continent is. If you compare it
Right.
to the size of the United States, you'll see how big Australia is for only a population of 25 million, very
Right.
sparsely populated, but a very large continent. But those cities on the East Coast, the main thing that will change them is how far north or south they are, because again, we're opposite to you. The further north we go, the more humid it gets. As you go
Right.
north, you get closer to the equator, closer to Asia, Southeast Asia. So it gets warmer up there, whereas down below. So Melbourne would be a cold, wet, and dry, a bit like where I am in Adelaide. Good for wine. I'm in a famous wine region here, like the Napier Valley. It's a world famous wine area. McLaren Vale, Barossa Valley wine drinkers will understand that. Whereas Sydney and then Brisbane is a bit more humid as you go further north.
Man.